A young single mother walked out of a hospital in California. She told friends she'd be right back, just a quick trip to the parking lot. But she never returned. Hours later, her car was found abandoned and burning miles away. For 4 years, her family received chilling phone calls, until one day, her remains were discovered. Who was stalking her, and why did she vanish that night? On the surface, Diana's life seemed simple. She was a 32-year-old single mother who lived in Anaheim, California, with her 4-year-old son. By all accounts, Diana was devoted to him. Everything in her life revolved around the little boy. Her friends often said she was the type of person who never chased the spotlight, someone who would rather stay at home with a book than go out to a crowded bar. Her coworkers described her as gentle, dependable, and, almost to a fault, selfless. But beneath that quiet surface, an invisible shadow had been growing. It was May 28, 1980, a night that should have been ordinary, forgettable even. But for Diana Scott, a quiet young mother from Stanton, California, it was the night everything changed. Diana was known for her gentle nature. She worked as a secretary for a local shop that sold medical supplies. She wasn't the type to go out partying or draw attention to herself. She kept her life simple: work, home, and caring for her young son, Sean, who was only 4 years old. Her parents, Jacob and Vera, often said Diana's world revolved around that little boy. But in the weeks before her disappearance, something unnerving had begun. At first they were odd, but not overtly threatening. A man's voice would murmur things to her, sometimes tender, sometimes cruel. Sometimes he would claim to love her, other times he would spit venom, calling her names, hurling insults, and terrifying warnings. She confided to her parents that the man seemed to be watching her, describing in chilling detail the color of her clothing that day or the way she had worn her hair. At times, Diana tried to laugh it off, but the truth was she was frightened. Who was this man? Why was he fixated on her? And more disturbingly, how did he seem to know so much about her daily life? She admitted she recognized the voice but couldn't place it. What unsettled her the most was the content of the calls. One night, the man told her, "I'm watching you." Another time, "You should be mine." Her family urged her to take precautions, but Diana, ever polite and reserved, brushed it off. She didn't like to cause alarm. During the day, Diana went about her life as normally as she could, spending hours balancing paperwork and helping her employer with daily operations. In the evenings, she doted on her son. She rarely dated, and when she did, it was casual. Her family said she wasn't looking for love. She was looking for safety. Her friends knew about the strange calls. One coworker recalled her saying, "He's out there. I don't know who, but he's out there and he wants me." The man's voice was never identified. Sometimes he threatened to kill her. Other times he said things so personal that she felt he had been sitting in the shadows of her own home. Her parents begged her to go to the police, but Diana was reluctant. Without knowing who was making the calls or proof of what was happening, what could the authorities really do? So she lived in silence, balancing her quiet daytime world against the dread of her nights. On that night in May, that evening, Diana attended a staff meeting at her workplace. It was supposed to be a routine discussion, but things quickly took a turn when one of her coworkers, a young man named Conrad, suddenly complained of feeling ill. His arm was swollen, red, and painful. Another colleague insisted he go to the hospital. Diana, always willing to help, offered to drive. Around 9 p.m., she drove Conrad and another coworker to the University of California Irvine Medical Center. They checked in, and doctors determined that Conrad had been bitten by a black widow spider. The bite wasn't life-threatening, but it needed immediate treatment. While the doctors worked, Diana and her other coworker waited with him. They passed the time, talking, laughing quietly, even as the hospital halls echoed with late-night sounds. Stretchers rolling, intercoms buzzing, footsteps clicking on polished floors. By midnight, Conrad had been treated and given a prescription. Diana, ever thoughtful, offered to retrieve his car from the parking lot so it would be easier for him to get home once discharged. Her coworkers agreed. That was the last time anyone saw Diana Scott alive. Pam later recalled that Diana seemed relaxed, even cheerful. She kept checking her watch, mentioning she wanted to get home to her son. There was nothing about her demeanor that suggested fear, at least not outwardly. But when Pam and Conrad went to pick up his prescription, Diana told them she'd fetch her car from the parking lot to circle around and meet them at the entrance. They agreed. Pam said she expected Diana to pull up in just a minute or two. Instead, what came was something no one could have imagined. Moments later, they saw Diana's car speeding towards them, but something was wrong. She wasn't behind the wheel. The car swerved, its headlights cutting across the lot. Then, in an instant, it accelerated and disappeared into the dark. Pam and Conrad were stunned. They thought maybe she had been forced to drive off, or maybe something had gone terribly wrong. Hours later, at 2 a.m., police discovered the car abandoned in an alleyway. Inside, they found Diana's belongings, her purse, her car keys, and a scarf that she had been wearing earlier that evening. But of Diana herself, there was no trace. It was as though she had been swallowed by the night. From that moment on, the case of Diana Scott consumed her parents. Jacob and Vera plastered her photo on missing posters, called local news stations, and begged for leads. But answers were few, and the questions only grew darker. Had Diana been abducted from the parking lot? Who was behind the wheel of her car? And most haunting of all, was the anonymous caller somehow connected to it all? Within a week, those questions grew sharper, because the phone rang. Vera answered, her heart skipping. On the other end, a man's voice whispered, "I've got her." The calls didn't stop. Week after week, for years, the phone would ring. Sometimes he said Diana was still alive. Other times he claimed she had suffered. He seemed to take joy in tormenting them, dangling hope before snatching it away. The calls came mostly when Jacob wasn't home, as if the caller was deliberately targeting Vera. Police tapped the line, hoping to trace him, but he always hung up too quickly. To Vera, the sound of the phone became both a lifeline and a curse. She dreaded answering, yet couldn't stop herself. What if somehow Diana was reaching out through those calls? What if there was still a chance?
The night Diana Scott vanished, the Orange County Sheriff's Department began their search with urgency. A car found burning in the middle of nowhere was alarming enough, but the fact that the registered owner had disappeared without a trace made it a nightmare case from the start. Detectives scoured the scorched remains of her Toyota. The vehicle was reduced to a skeleton, but something disturbed them. There were no signs of blood, no evidence of a struggle. To them, it felt staged. Whoever had taken Diana didn't want to hide the car, he wanted it to be found. He wanted it to send a message. Her coworkers were interviewed again and again. They repeated what they had seen: Diana offering to retrieve the car, walking out into the dark hospital lot, and then gone. Minutes later, the car sped past them like a ghost in the night. It made no sense. The police investigated several men connected to Diana's workplace. One coworker in particular drew suspicion due to his erratic behavior and rumored fixation on her. Mike Butler. He was the brother of a woman Diana worked with, a man who had shown an unsettling interest in her. He was known to linger around the shop, watching. Quiet, brooding, and deeply troubled, he fit the profile of someone capable of obsession. But when detectives questioned him, they found no evidence connecting him to her disappearance, no physical proof, no witness placing him at the hospital that night, just suspicion. Still, her parents always believed he was the one. When the phone rang at the Scott household days later, Diana's mother hesitated before picking it up. "Hello?" she asked softly. A pause. Then a man's voice, low, almost calm. "I've got her." Those 3 words sent chills through her body. Before she could respond, the line went dead. It wasn't the last call. Over the next weeks, then months, the calls became a grim routine. Sometimes the caller professed love. Other times, he was cruel. "She's mine now," or "You'll never see her again. Don't bother looking." Each call came in the evening, often when Diana's mother was home alone. The police set up recording devices, attempted to trace the calls, but every time the caller hung up too quickly. One evening, the caller slipped. He phoned while Diana's father was home. When he answered, the caller froze. Then, with a sudden click, the line went dead. That detail stuck with detectives. Whoever the man was, he wanted to speak to the mother, only her. It was a personal game. As weeks bled into months, Diana's parents tried to keep life steady for their grandson. The boy was too young to understand what had happened to his mother. To him, she was just gone. At night, when the phone rang, Diana's mother would pick up, bracing herself for the familiar voice. The man would sometimes whisper, sometimes shout. But one call in particular left her shaken. "I killed her." The voice was matter of fact, not angry, not gloating, just stating a truth. That was the moment her mother knew, deep down, that Diana was never coming home. Meanwhile, Diana's son grew up without his mother, raised by grandparents who tried their best to shield him from the shadow that lingered over the family. Then, in 1984, 4 long years after that night at the hospital, the mystery deepened. Construction workers clearing land in Anaheim unearthed skeletal remains. Alongside the bones were the charred remains of a dog and a turquoise ring. Her family was called to identify the items. Her mother's hands shook as she held the ring, instantly recognizing it. It was Diana's. There was no doubt. It had been Diana's favorite, one she wore every day without fail. Dental records confirmed the truth. The remains were Diana's. The discovery should have brought closure, but instead, it only raised more questions. How had she died? Why had her body been left there, discarded in the dirt? And most hauntingly of all, why was the caller still tormenting them, even after her remains had been found? The coroner determined Diana was likely dead since soon after her disappearance, which meant that while her family had been clinging to hope for 4 years, the cruel truth was that she had been gone almost from the start. And yet, for those same 4 years, the phone had been ringing. The day the news of the discovery broke, the phone rang again. Vera picked up, her voice trembling. "Is Diana home?" the caller asked. It was the final twist of the knife. After the remains were identified, the calls stopped. The silence was deafening. Police continued investigating, but leads dried up. No one was ever arrested. No one was ever charged.
Theories abound. Some believe the caller was Diana's killer, relishing the pain he inflicted. Others think he was a cruel opportunist, following the case in the media and exploiting the family's grief. To this day, the truth has never been uncovered. For Jacob and Vera, life became a cycle of interviews, awareness campaigns, and tireless pleas for justice. They warned others to take harassment seriously, long before stalking was recognized as a widespread danger. But as the decades passed, Diana's case faded from headlines, leaving only the haunting memory of a young mother stolen in her prime and a phone line that once carried the voice of evil. Diana Scott's story is not only about her disappearance, but the shadows it left behind. A mother and father tormented by the ring of a telephone, a child who grew up without the woman who loved him most, and a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest cruelty lies not just in taking a life, but in leaving questions that may never be answered. Who was the man on the other end of the line? Was he watching that night from the hospital parking lot? Was he someone Diana knew, or a stranger who saw an opportunity and seized it?
The cruelest twist of the entire case was that even after 1984, the calls didn't stop. For years, Diana's mother continued to pick up the phone and hear the voice of the same man. Calm, cold, always fixated on her daughter. Some believe the calls proved her killer was still alive, free, and perhaps even living nearby. Others wondered if he had an accomplice, someone who continued the torment even after her death. But one thing was certain: the voice on the other end of the line was the same. The man who had stalked Diana, taken her, and destroyed her family's peace was still out there. Police pursued countless leads. Some believed it was a coworker, someone close to her life. Others suspected an unknown stranger, a drifter who had fixated on her. The most enduring theory, however, remained that of Mike Butler, the troubled man with the unsettling presence. He lived not far from where Diana's remains were found. He had no alibi for the night she disappeared, and his personality matched the obsessive caller's pattern: unpredictable, obsessive, alternating between love and hatred. But without proof, it was just speculation. By the late 1980s, the case had gone cold. No new evidence, no confessions, no arrests. But for Diana's family, the nightmare never ended. Every time the phone rang, they wondered if it was him again, the man who had taken everything from them, still lurking in the shadows, feeding on their pain. Her son grew up with only fading memories of his mother, pieced together from photographs and stories. He became an adult without ever knowing why she was taken from him. For the community, Diana's case became one of those stories whispered about, an unsolved tragedy that lingered like a ghost. In the end, Diana's story is not just about what happened to her, but what it left behind: a mother and father haunted by a ringing phone, a community that learned evil can hide in plain sight, and a question that still lingers more than 40 years later. Who was the man on the other end of the line? Was he watching that night from the hospital parking lot, waiting for Diana to walk alone? Was he someone she trusted? Or was he a stranger who crossed paths with her in a moment of vulnerability? The answers remain buried in silence, just like Diana's voice on the other end of a call that never came. And perhaps that's the cruelest part, because sometimes the shadow of the unknown is darker than the truth itself. If Diana's story gripped you, don't let it fade into silence. Subscribe for more stories of mysteries, disappearances, and chilling truths that still haunt families today. Hit the like button if you believe cases like this deserve more attention, and share this video to keep Diana's story alive. Where are you watching from? Drop in the comments. We always read them.